Shadi, and today I'm going to talk about the CO2 emission trends across the world. Now, the first question that comes to our mind is, what are CO2 emissions and why do we care about them? The CO2 emissions are the extraneous emissions that are put into the atmosphere by humans because of the imbalance that we've created by cutting down trees and burning fossil fuels, which release all of these emissions into the atmosphere. Now, why do we care about this? So the most recent devastating report from UN says that CO2 emissions must go to zero by 2050 to avoid the worst effects of climate change. For this, I've done a historical analysis to kind of figure out where the problem really lies. So if we are looking at the whole world's picture starting 1960, we can see that US was one of the first ones to have an extremely high CO2 emission per person, and we can see that in 2005 China took over USA as the world's largest CO2 emitter, and currently China sits at number 1 while India sits at number 3, USA sits at number 2. So I've done an analysis where we're going to go step by step and understand what problems the world has faced with CO2 emission trends and how they have fixed it or how they can fix it. So first, talking about Europe's history. So Europe was one of the first ones to have a problem with CO2 emissions. As we can see, UK was one of the highest ones, but in 1950s Luxembourg started having extraneously high emissions in the world, and this was mainly because of a high car ownership and high usage of non-renewable energy. But we can see that as 2000s came by, there was a significant decrease in all of Europe's emissions, which is a really good thing. So promotion of more renewable energy sources, for example, Netherlands basing most of their energy on windmills, etc., has actually come in really handy to protect our environment. Now moving on to North America. So North America has always had a huge problem with per person CO2 emissions. So as you can see, even as early as 1930s and 1940s, you can see that the per person emission is really high in US as well as Canada, not so high in Mexico. So coming here, we can see that Mexico has been doing well across the years, but we can see that US and Canada both have peaked at about 21, 22 per person emission, but in the recent years we've observed a slight drop, which is somewhat around after 2000. We've seen that the per person emissions are actually dropped for both Canada and USA, but not enough. So here is a major problem where we have a lot of scope of reduction in per person emission of carbon dioxide. So USA actually needs to follow the lead taken by Europe and clean up their act. And moving on to the second problem in the world right now, it's actually China, India and Japan. So if we started really back, we can see that the main problem here is actually not the same as what USA is facing. So USA has a really high per person emission. However, China has a much lower, significantly lower per person emission. However, we can see that the population rise here has actually resulted in creating an overall extremely high emission. So here, the takeaway for us would be that even a small amount of reduction in per person CO2 emission is actually going to be a significant reduction in the overall CO2 emission done by the country. Now, this information is up until 2014, but I would want to see what the current scenario looks like. So I have good news. CO2 emissions in 2017 were the same as 1990, which is great news. And we've seen a remarkable slowdown in global CO2 emissions, and US had the largest decline in the world for the 9th time in this century, which is again great news. So up from 2014 to 2017, the world has actually moved forward and reduced or maintained their CO2 emissions, which is good news. However, I have some bad news as well. CO2 emissions are expected to rise again in 2018. So after the Paris Climate Agreement that has been signed, we are expecting a rise in these emissions and then a sudden fall, but at this point of time, we really don't know. The world really does not know how to control this situation. And the emissions were flat for 3 years, now they're rising again, so we're in a bad position again. So I think the key takeaways here would be to learn from Europe. Both USA as well as Asia need to learn from Europe. USA can actually significantly reduce their per person CO2 emission, and India and China can actually, even a little bit of reduction in their per person emission is going to have a huge impact in saving the world. So that's my presentation. Thank you.